Whether you operate one forklift or thousands, one location or hundreds, the new My Toyota customer portal can help you optimize your operation and material handling equipment. This one-stop, free-to-use platform is designed to help you take control of your information and make smarter decisions, all at the touch of a button. Register and access your data today at my.toyotaforklift.com. That's my.toyotaforklift.com.
Today's warehouse needs to keep inventory moving smoothly and quickly. Meet these challenges with on-demand warehouse labeling from Brother Mobile Solutions. Our mobile and industrial printers will help optimize your operations to achieve the speed, reliability, and durability your warehouse needs. With easy integration for existing warehouse technology, convenient portability, and upfront affordability, Brother Mobile Solutions is at your side when it comes to warehouse labeling. Try one for free today by visiting brothermobilesolutions.com/new warehouse or click the link in the show notes. That's brothermobilesolutions.com/new warehouse to try one for free today.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. Today's episode, I will be joined by Tim Victor, and he is the project lead for electric vehicles over at Scale Microgrid Solutions. And we're going to be talking a little bit about, first, microgrids. We're going to dig into that. What is that exactly, and what does that mean for the warehousing side of things? And then we're going to talk about electric vehicles and electrifying your fleet, what that means for someone that's maybe an operator of a fleet or on the warehouse side as well. So we're going to dive into all that, and I'm pretty interested to talk about this just recently at Manifest, and there was certainly a lot of talk about electrification of fleets there as well. So Tim, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
Definitely happy to have you on as well. I think this is a pretty interesting topic and one that's certainly being tossed around a lot lately and a lot developing there. So why don't you tell us, before we dig in, I mean, you work for a company called Scale Microgrid Solutions, and I think probably not everybody might know exactly what a microgrid is. Myself, I'm somewhat familiar, but I could definitely use a deeper dig into it. So why don't you tell us, what is a microgrid?
Yeah, for sure. So the best way that I can kind of describe it, and in the market, there's a couple of different ways that people think of this, but the best way of viewing a microgrid is really just kind of thinking it is a self-sustained microgrid, or self-sustained grid that is actually just a smaller version of the bigger one. But the big part of that is you have the ability to actually pull away from the larger grid.
Okay.
And that requires certain assets within that system. Traditionally, those are kind of like the rotating assets that can kind of set the voltage and frequency of the grid, which is also called a grid forming asset. In the past, that was mostly, diesel generators, things like in the Army, when they had bases, they would have things like microgrids where they were using generators to produce that grid. Nowadays, we have the ability to do so with solar and battery storage. And so really a microgrid is just a combination of all these different types of assets that are working in concert that can work in parallel with the utility, meaning that the utility is still connected and you're picking and choosing how to use energy. It can also work when that utility drops off and it has the ability to produce its own energy and do it in a safe way.
Interesting. And so, obviously, I think the last point you touched on there, the drop off, I think is a huge thing, obviously, especially for those of us that are in, warehousing fulfillment, because, if we lose power, we're pretty much like that in the water, right? We can't really ship based on, the reliability we have on systems and things these days. So it's extremely important. So tell us a little bit about, maybe for better understanding, like give an example of how a warehouse or fulfillment center would be a part of a microgrid or have a microgrid.
Yeah, so there are kind of two different ways to look at microgrids, and I think the one that kind of shows up in the media, maybe the one that kind of most people think about when they think of a microgrid, is kind of the community-based microgrid, which is essentially this idea where you're going to add, a bunch of houses and a bunch of buildings, and you're all going to make it a kind of an interconnected type of thing. Those are very much almost impossible to kind of create right now because of regulatory and the way that whole thing works. But what we do at Scale is we really focus on this idea of doing that behind the meter. So essentially behind one meter, we can build a multi-asset microgrid that serves a single purpose there.
Interesting.
And so that's a lot easier to obtain. It's a lot easier to kind of get all those things lined up and meet the requirements that are needed. But that's kind of what Scale really focuses on, is building these for individual customers. It makes contracting a lot easier because you have one customer that you have to contract with. And essentially it allows those types of facilities to have that resilient power that they need.
Very interesting. And you kind of, I guess, started to get into, what you guys do a little bit there. And I think it's interesting, the concept, especially for distribution facilities. And, usually you're in an area where you see a concentrated amount of distribution centers, like all kind of grouped together. So there's a lot of potential there for these microgrids to be really effective for those companies. And, companies like Scale Microgrid Solutions certainly can help with that. So I want to give us a little bit of a breakdown kind of what you guys really do as a company. What services are you offering?
Yeah, so we are a vertically integrated distributed energy platform is really the best way to describe it. So we do, I would say 90% of the work we do are in microgrids, but we also have some community solar assets. We kind of dabble in a couple more of the investment side. So essentially what it was is that Scale about 4 or so years ago took a large investment to be able to invest in our own projects and to be able to actually own and operate our own projects. So what we're able to do is actually show up to a site, do everything from design to implementation and commissioning all the way through operations and maintenance, and also be able to own that entire process because of the fact that we use our own capital. And so what we're able to do essentially is provide this as zero up front. And it's allowing these systems that usually weren't really attainable by nations that didn't have a large bank account in the background to kind of get access to some of these services, because we can essentially spread it across a longer term and be able to reduce that risk and pull that off of the responsibility of that entity.
Interesting. So I think that, it sounds like that would really kind of lower the barrier of entry for businesses that want to take advantage of like a microgrid setup. Is that right? Yeah,
and that's the idea, is that I think Scale kind of came into this to try to get the idea of microgrids or the microgrid technology into the market that really wasn't being served, but also had a great use for it, is kind of these, single warehouses or single C&I facilities or, schools and things that kind of come in a little bit more discrete package and not usually able to kind of get access to technology like this.
Very interesting. I think that's a smart way to go about it too. I think especially as you see, I think usually, the typical thing, right? These new, kind of concepts and setups and solutions, at first before they're kind of widely adopted, they can be, pretty cost heavy. So I think that approach really makes a lot of sense and allows people to kind of easily get into the microgrid game. I don't know what you guys call it, but yeah.
Yeah. And the other part of that too, which I think is really cool, is that the people in our company, we've been doing this for a good amount of time. And so we're willing to kind of like pick the technologies that we're willing to contract behind, which inherently means that we're kind of siding with the customer, because we don't want to take a technology that's not going to last long, because that hurts us. And so to me, and this kind of gets into the fleet electrification market, is we're actually doing a lot of work on our back end to make sure that what we provide is actually like amazingly as high of quality as we can, because ultimately it's our risk. And so what we're able to do is actually reduce that technology risk that maybe that C&I customer would typically have to take on their own. They can kind of come to someone like us and say, I just want the outcome, and you guys can choose how to actually pursue that. And you can, I mean, you know, maybe more sustainable, less sustainable, more economical, less economical, but like the general idea being that I don't need to understand how that works, and I can still get the benefits from it.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and certainly allows people to have more flexibility there from all different business sizes too, which I think is really a great thing. So you kind of touched on a little bit of the electrification of fleets, but obviously, you know, when it comes to power and electric and all these things, I mean, not only on the industrial side, but also on the consumer side too. I mean, electric vehicles are obviously a huge talking point, right? I mean, everybody's, deciding whether or not are they going to get electric vehicle, hybrid, something like that. And I think, right now, especially in the logistics supply chain world, a lot of the conversation is around the electrification of trucks and courier vans and things like that. So tell us a little bit about, because you're the electric vehicles project lead, right, for Scale Microgrid Solutions. So tell us a little bit about what that role really means and how you're kind of working with electric vehicles within these microgrid setups. Yeah.
So as I mentioned before, Scale is kind of more of a broad energy platform. So what that means is that we're in multiple different markets. I work next to individuals who are working within the agricultural business, as well as, some of the public entities and schools. And that application really does go off in multiple tangents. And kind of the one that I kind of picked up was essentially trying to apply the technology to fleet electrification, or just the growth of electric vehicles. And what we've seen is that there's really probably 2 or 3 main reasons why, distributed energy or microgrids start to really help that process. And one of them being that there's a lot of capacity shortfall. So like especially in California, you see this where a lot of these warehouses that are going to have these electric vehicles, these large Class 8 semis, or even the package delivery vehicles, they're all very much next to each other, and they tend to cluster. And so what you see is that the first movers kind of go out and ask for that capacity upgrade to bring in power to their site. Well, the way that works with the utility is that there's a substation that kind of controls most of that area, and individually you're eating up more and more of that capacity to a point where that substation actually can't provide more capacity. And then it becomes an investment for the utility, and they have to go out and essentially upgrade that system. So it's kind of like what we're seeing now is we're seeing a bit of a land grab, where you can actually see some of these companies are going out much earlier and asking for that capacity and trying to see what they can get. And then there's a lot of areas that they don't have access to that capacity. And so that's kind of where the microgrid really adds a lot of value. We actually have a project that we're working on in East Los Angeles that they were essentially using about 60% of their service capacity right now. It's a refrigerated warehouse, so they had a decent amount of load there. But they had 45 trucks in that location, and they were going to electrify 30 of the 45 in one fall swoop. So essentially what they were saying is, we're going to bring in these trucks and we need to put in the charging infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens is that the amount of power required for the charging infrastructure, plus the existing power that they're already using, put them over the limit of what their service capacity was at. So they would have had to go to the utility and say, hey, I need a bigger service, I need another service, or some type of essential additional capacity at that site. What the microgrid actually did is we built a solar battery storage and a backup generator system that actually continually reduces that demand to the point that we're always below the previous service capacity. And so what it means is that we avoided a service upgrade, which in SCE territory right now is like at least 1 to 2 years. And we're able to build a system that actually self-consumes enough of the energy that you don't have to go get that service capacity. And we're also doing, solar and battery storage and reducing costs associated with electricity consumption. So that's one of them, is that the capacity side of it, we see that a lot on the distribution side, that a lot of these locations, you'll start seeing that almost everyone's asking for more capacity. And by using on-site energy, you can kind of avoid a lot of that.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a pretty interesting, challenge, because you even said, like this example you gave, I mean, is a refrigerated space, and obviously that's a huge draw on power. So then to go and then now we're trying to set up the infrastructure to be able to, like you said, charge, another 30 trucks as well is a huge draw as well. So being able to have that flexibility, and then, also in a potentially more sustainable way by using solar too, I think is a big win, certainly for that company. And I think a lot of people are, looking at electrifying their fleet and trying to figure out what the best way to go about that is. So, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, where do you see that maybe like most companies are at kind of in that journey, or I mean, are we still very much early on for electrifying fleets? Like I'm thinking there's a lot of companies that still need to convert.
Yeah, and I think what I see mostly right now are drivers coming from clients. So essentially, a lot of these distributions, they have their end client who essentially has their sustainability goals, and they're trying to go through their ESG goals, and that kind of flows down. And so this exact client, or this exact customer that we have, has a very prominent client that they're serving, and it's kind of, it's not really that there's a requirement to meet the needs of that, but it's more that they're trying to guarantee their business in the future. So they're essentially moving forward with it, knowing that it's going to have to happen at some point. So they're kind of essentially saying, we're very dedicated to our customer there. And so we're going to keep moving down this fleet electrification route to make sure that they can continue being, at the top provider for them.
Step. Do you know how many steps your warehouse workers are taking a day? When your workers are walking, you're losing money. Endless trips to the printer or computer add up fast. Newcastle's mobile industrial carts with integrated power eliminate the walking to stationary printers and computers, keeping workers focused on high-value tasks, often doubling their output. Thousands of powered cart installations, including ones at the new warehouse's own micro-fulfillment center and in my previous jobs, prove that Newcastle customers get more done and save money. To learn more, head to newcastlesys.com. That's newcastlesys.com. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I didn't even think about that, because, like you said, there's these companies that are, they're revamping like their sustainability goals and things like that, and a lot of them are saying like, only work with like suppliers or vendors that are, also tracking towards our same sustainability goals. So I guess that's kind of a further push, like you said, to electrify some of these fleets where, it may just be, somebody that they're working with that's going to end up requiring that, which I think makes a lot of sense. So it's pretty interesting.
And the one thing, I'll just add to that really quickly, like the other part of that is policy, right? Is especially in California and the Northeast right now, they're passing these clean truck rules where they're essentially saying at some point in the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to be a requirement. And so really what I see, it's a combination of both. It's a combination of, well, my clients really want it anyway, and also I'm going to have to do it at some point, so I might as well start now. And I think especially with the policy pushing things to happen so quickly, there's just a lot of incentives, meaning that you have the ability to actually de-risk your projects right now. I think as time goes on and the longer you wait, the less of that funding is going to be available, and the more that you're going to have to take on yourself as a fleet. And so that's another part of this, is that people are moving quickly to kind of grab some of that available incentive to try to de-risk their transition as much as they can.
Interesting. Yeah. I think that's a good point too. I mean, while the incentive is there, I guess you might as well take advantage of it, right? And I think that's it's a really interesting thing, because I mean, you see even, what some of the carbon measures and things like that are, being proposed in legislation in some places too as well. I mean, I think it's inevitable, like you're saying, that, something's going to be mandatory probably at some point to move in this direction. So getting kind of the early jump on it and trying to build on that, I think makes a lot of sense. So, I think obviously the big thing about the electrification of fleets obviously is getting the electric vehicles in the first place, right? But then there's all of the points at which these electric vehicles touch as well, right? Which are the facilities themselves, like the warehousing facilities. And obviously, if we're talking about a carrier or something and they're going to electrify their fleet, they're probably going to put in some charging infrastructure at their facilities and their locations. But what I'm really interested to know is, from a shipper perspective that doesn't necessarily have their own fleet, right? They're just shipping out products and they're working with different carriers who may be electrifying. How does that look for them? I mean, do you see, because I know myself, right? I have an electric vehicle, or had an electric vehicle. I have a hybrid now, but we go to certain places and there's chargers. I'm going to charge up because there's an opportunity to charge whether I'm low or not. Do you see where warehouse facilities would be allowing carriers to charge at their facility, like while they're in the yard or while they're waiting at a dock door or something like that? Is that something that's on the horizon or happening?
So I think it's on the horizon. I mean, what we see now is mostly what we see being electrified right now are fleets that are all behind the fence and they're all dwelling in one location. So what you see is they're putting in charging infrastructure that serves their own need, and it doesn't really serve a secondary need other than their own fleet. I think as more and more of this occurs, you're going to start seeing that transactional piece where you're going to have your own fleet, and then and if you have other vehicles coming in at that time, you're going to probably provide a way for them to have charging available, but being able to understand the complexities of like who pays for that, why, and like how much do they pay, and all those different pieces that kind of come into that, I think are just a little bit too far right now for us to kind of think about. But I do imagine definitely an area where and I suggest this too whenever I talk to customers who are kind of like, well, like we go get fuel from outside the depot, so why would I bring it inside? And so one of the big things there is like when you're able to put chargers on your own facility, you inherently have much, much more control over the cost and the availability of that fuel. So now you're essentially taking in the fuel procurement yourself and you have more control. And so when you have customers coming in or you have additional fleets coming in to drop things off, you now have an ability to maybe make it additional revenue or essentially look at it as ways to support your customers more. I think there's a lot of different synergies that kind of come in there, but having more control over being able to give out fuel or to be able to dispense fuel to vehicles, either yourself or someone else, to me is something that is an opportunity. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to end up looking like, but I would bet that there's going to be benefits from it other than just, for your own fleet.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting conversation because I was thinking the same thing. It's like, well, you have the situation where, if a different company is coming in and they're picking up a load from you and, they're there for an hour or something getting loaded up or unloaded, whatever the case may be. And you have chargers, like, can they charge and who's going to take or eat that cost? But at the same time, it's like, well, if you're going to say they can't charge and then, they need to go and charge somewhere on the road to finish the delivery, like you're increasing your shipping time. So there's like a interesting trade-off there that I think would be interesting to see how companies kind of figure that out and work together to kind of balance that out. Because I think, if we look at electric, stuff is like, I think the last thing that a company would want to hear is that like, well, we couldn't make the delivery on time because we couldn't find a charging station somewhere, right? Because I think that's one of the big challenges too, is like the range as well. So I mean, I guess in that regard, what are you seeing as companies are coming out with more electric vehicles, specifically targeted at like shipping. How are the ranges increasing, and what is kind of the average typical range that someone can expect now?
We'll be back after a quick break.
You hear a lot about supply chains these days, because if the past couple years have taught us anything, it's that an efficient, well-managed supply chain is absolutely critical to keeping businesses successful and consumers happy. I'm Will Haywood, and I host a podcast called All Business, No Boundaries, where we talk about supply chains, how they work, what happens when they don't, and the innovations that are redefining what's possible in the world of logistics. Join me for insightful interviews with thought leaders and industry experts. We discuss how optimizing supply chains can break down the barriers that are holding businesses back. That's All Business, No Boundaries by DHL Supply Chain. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
So what I've seen, so again, I am a little removed from the vehicle side, but I do, interact directly with those OEMs when we're partnered up for projects. And so what I see is kind of this benchmark is the 300-mile mark, which is kind of it's a mark that they use in the passenger side as well. But the idea being that a majority of the trips can be done within that 300-mile loop. Mm-hmm. And I think we're definitely, if we're not there already, we're going to be there this year on a majority of the Class 8, and then that extends down depending on the need of that route. But I think we're pretty much there. I think we're in the first tranche of most vehicles can solve most of the routes. Mm-hmm. The difficult part is when you get into the longer haul, which is something that we generally we're monitoring, but I do not know how that market's going to look. I think if you look at the providers like the Teslas of the world, they believe that their semis are going to have so much range that you're going to be able to do long haul with them. Yeah. But it requires so much power infrastructure for those large batteries that go into those vehicles, right, that it can be detrimental to have that much capacity in the vehicle, because it requires more time, it requires more power to get into the vehicle to refuel it. Mm. And so really what I would suggest there is that you should definitely be looking to match the range with your routes. And I think that's something that maybe isn't as precedent in the past, because gas and diesel was essentially, you would overfill essentially for your route almost every time, just because the density was there. I think now it's trying to get those a little bit closer to each other, where you actually are trying to match range with the routes you're doing. But then to get past that next part, right, is the opportunity charging or the outside depot charging, which I do see a good use case for. And I think there's going to be some of these like public charging depots that essentially show up and allow you to get that extra 20 or 30% to keep doing your route. And I think it's going to be very valuable and important to get through that. What we focus on is trying to make sure that depot that you're working on has the ability to, supply, 80% of your need, because most of it's going to happen there. Yeah. And that's kind of where we like to focus. But I do see the opportunity for the outside of depot type of charging. It's just, it gets really complicated into where they go, and also like how the economics work for those, and who's taking the risk on utilization and things like that. There's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting, evolving conversation on how that'll look and what it'll look like in the long run. But I think it's pretty interesting to see how companies are starting to do this and being able to kind of adopt this electrification into their fleets and utilize companies that are utilizing it too. So that'd be really interesting to see. So I appreciate you giving all these insights on it and really kind of enlightening us a little bit on the microgrid side and also the electrification side. So I guess before we wrap up, I mean, the final question here, if a company is listening now and, they're interested in potentially electrifying their fleet, I mean, where do they really start? Like, what's the first step? I mean, is it as simple as getting an electric truck? Probably not.
Yeah. So I'm not going to say it's not a mistake. I think it's just the way this kind of worked before is we took the infrastructure for granted, right? So if you bought a diesel truck or if you bought a gas vehicle, you didn't have to think about where the fuel came from because the infrastructure is already there across the board. It's there for you to already be able to operate that. We're now in a realm where the vehicle you buy does not have the infrastructure ready to go. And so you have to pair those together and you have to think about them at the same time. That doesn't always mean that you're going to have to purchase your own charging infrastructure, but it might mean that you need to partner with, a charging network provider or someone like that so that you know that your fleet has access to chargers. And I think over time that's going to evolve as well. But, the other side of this is, and this is kind of why, this is probably the number one reason why I think microgrids and distributed energy have such a big piece when it comes to fleet electrification. It's just because of the fact that it's very complicated to understand how much electricity costs. So from a commercial perspective, you have time of use rates and you have demand charges and all of those things combine into making it almost not very, how do I say this? It's not very easy to predict exactly what you're going to pay for your electricity. And it depends on the way you have to charge. If you have to charge during the day, at night, short amount of time, long amount of time, all those things come together. And one of the easiest ways to hedge that risk is to actually self-produce on site. Because if you put, if you put solar panels on your site, what you're able to do is produce power at the same amount or the same cost every time. So every kilowatt hour that you produce is generally the same price, and you can utilize it how you want to. And what this does is that if you look at it over time, you actually move towards more fuel predictability as opposed to less. And so you're actually able to get very predictable fuel costs when you're able to self-produce. Okay. And what that does is it reduces a lot of this risk of like, well, this month I paid twice as much as I did last month. Really what it does is it creates more of a stable view across the board. And so when you're thinking about, what do I purchase first or what do I get first? Really all of these things are kind of at the same time where the vehicles, the OEMs are going to be very interested in selling you their truck, but generally they're charging agnostic. So they might suggest certain charging vendors or charging station type of equipment for you, but generally they're all going to kind of work together. And so they're not going to say this is exactly what you need to buy. They'll kind of push you in the right direction. And so what that means is that they're not exactly going to tell you how to do it. The charging station providers are also agnostic to the vehicles. So they're also not going to tell you exactly how to do everything together. And then people like us are essentially agnostic to both of those, where the charging and the vehicles don't matter as much as all of the power that's being used at that site. And so it can be hard because it's hard to see or hard to talk to, who can help me do this entire ecosystem. And we do our best to kind of sit in that role, but generally, there's a lot of consultants out there who can help you think through how do I combine these three aspects or these multiple aspects into my fleet transition. But generally, probably step one every time is talking to the utility because of the fact that the utility does generally control your timeline of deployment. If you do not have power and they are going to take 6 to 8 years to provide power like they do in some places, that makes it very difficult for you to go out and purchase vehicles or purchase chargers.
Right. Very interesting. Yeah. And I think it sounds like you, instead of just going out and buying an electric vehicle, you got to really think about the overall infrastructure and kind of the long term, what that's going to look like. And I think that makes a lot of sense based on our conversation today and kind of the information that you gave here. So really interesting stuff. And it'd be interesting to see how these microgrid ideas and electrification of fleets continue to evolve. I think there's a lot of potential for microgrids to be really successful in these types of kind of logistics parks and things like that, where you see like multiple buildings in the same concentrated region and being able to have some type of shared situation there. I think there's a lot of potential for that. So it'd be interesting to see how that continues to grow. So Tim, I want to thank you for coming on the show today and sharing all these great insights. I think is really enlightening a little bit on how these work and also kind of the benefits and potential there is for electrification. So if people want to find out more about Scale Microgrid Solutions, how can they do that?
Yeah, so we successfully reduced our name down to Scale Microgrids. So if you go to scalemicrogrids.com, that's probably the easiest way to get to us. I'm also on LinkedIn all the time, unfortunately, and so that's a great way to reach me. But generally, there's a lot of people out in the market who are willing to help. I think a lot of people are really passionate about this, and so people like myself are always interested in talking. And maybe they're not the right person for that exact topic, but this market's pretty small, so we generally know exactly who to kind of like reorient and kind of help everybody get through this. I think ultimately, we all want to do this for more than just, the economic reasons. And so I think that's kind of my spiel there is that, ask for help and you'll be pushed in the right direction for sure.
All right, great. And we'll definitely put all that information at thenewwarehouse.com as well, so people can easily find it. So Tim, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more content from the New Warehouse, check out our new video series called All Hands on LinkedIn. Just search for the New Warehouse on LinkedIn and follow along.